introduce our next speaker, architect Suhasini Iyer, Principal Architect of Auroville Design Consultant Center for Scientific Research, Auroville. They aim to provide a simple and bold yet basic spaces capturing the essential to create harmony and balance between built and open spaces.
Hello, everybody. I'm Suhasini Iyer, an architect from Auroville. I'm the principal architect of a studio called the Auroville Design Consultants. We have the studio since the last 30 years, and almost most of our work is in solar passive architecture, sustainable urban development, appropriate building technologies, integrating water and waste management, and renewable energies. I'm very happy to be invited by ICON Best to participate in their international conference on built environment, science and technology which is trying to bring together academics, research, practice, and policy in the field of built environment. It's an, exemplary effort. Now, SRM Institute of Science and Technology is the university that is hosting it. It's one of the top universities in India with over 20,000 students, I'm told, and about 2,600 faculty, offering a wide range of undergrad, postgrad, and doctoral programs in engineering, management, medicine, health sciences, sciences, and humanities. I take the opportunity to really thank Dr. P. Satish Kumar, who's the dean, and Professor Pradeepa, who is convening this conference, and the coordinator, Professor Shanti Priya. My conference is part of the track which belongs to cities, neighborhoods, and built environment with sustainable neighborhood habitats. And I'm going to talk on the topic of sustainability by design, which is focused on settlement planning and design to meet the commitment to sustainable development goals. As you're aware, India has signed up as part of the United Nations effort towards sustainable development goals. And I also want to address the urgent need to amend the national building codes. So how am I going to do this? I'm going to do this by using one of the projects that we've been working on since the last 4 years, which is called the Humanscapes Habitat Project. I'm going to use this as a case study, how to actually talk about how design is a process rather than a product, because most of us as an architect look at design as an end product that we try to do with perfection, integrating all kinds of things. I'm going to talk about this project as a case study where the design is a process where we integrate geography, the natural and human environment of geography, climate, resources, and waste. So let's start with that. I'm going to share my screen so that all of you can participate in it. So you see, in 2015, I think about more than 190 countries of the world signed up for the Sustainable Development Goals. And this image shows you the 17 goals that India has committed to work towards to achieve these goals. Now, the project that I'm going to be showcasing here as a case study, we are addressing 10 of these 17 goals to show how within a settlement design, one can try with a least bit of effort to address several of these goals. So the goals we're addressing is good health and well-being, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation, and infrastructure, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life on land, and partnership for goals. Starting with, this is an image of the project, the phase 1 that has been completed about 2 years ago. And actually it was inaugurated in February 2018 by the Honorable Prime Minister of this country, Mr. Narendra Modi. And I'm going to talk about 7 different aspects that we tackled. One of the first things we did was we put together a group of experts from across the country to set benchmarks for each of these 7 sectors, to say what is it that we will try to achieve in this project, through this project, and what is the standards that are set as per the national building codes, and how can we do it better by being more appropriate to the context. So the first 2 aspects, which was land and water. Land in itself, when the site was identified and handed over for this project, we mapped it and we said minimum disturbance to natural topography, retain indigenous trees and landscaping with indigenous trees, and do the landscaping with native species only. Secure topsoil from the areas to be built to ensure fertility is retained to respread when the construction is done. Integrate flow channels, retain high percolation areas of no-build zones, create bioswales, collection ponds for surfaces, runoff, and other things. Why did we do this? So you see the site. Why we did this was, Tamil Nadu has a tendency to have periodic failure of rainfall. Most areas of Tamil Nadu is not fed with perennial rivers or even seasonal rivers. How do we actually take care of water supply? We are doing it either through groundwater or pipe water from reservoirs which are far away. But traditionally in Tamil Nadu, most towns and villages had passive strategies for potable water. And we have been looking at the vernacular solutions that were there, which is predating fossil fuel electrical energy. Learning from the solutions, one of the first things that we did was map the site, look at the flow channels, because flow channels and topography are how the earth has been carved over hundreds of years with the natural flow of water, wind, and sun. And when you map it and you work with it, you actually have the least resistance and minimal disasters. So once we knew the slopes of the site, we proposed bioswales to capture the rainwater, where you can see here, which is planted with indigenous species that hold the soil, including the topsoil, which was very carefully stacked and throughout the construction, so that the biodiversity and the microorganisms in the topsoil do not die. And it's respread so that the ground cover takes over. And at one point, between the ground cover, the shrubs and the trees, and collecting of the rainwater, you actually saturate the soil enough to have shallow wells from which you can draw water for drinking. But it's also helpful that the buildings itself, all the roof water, is channeled and carefully guided through a system of drains and collections to ponds or sunken courts, and then percolated also into the ground. Basically, in where this project is in Tamil Nadu, in Auroville, we get about 1.20 meters to 1.50 meters rainfall at an average. Of course, there are years where it's only 65, 70 centimeters. By making sure that every rain drop of water that falls on the site is collected, channeled, stored, percolated, and using a passive strategy of creating sponge effect, we're able to tap into this harvested rainwater to create a secondary source of potable water, thereby reducing our need to exploit groundwater. We went one step further. Now, that was the rainwater situation. We went one step further, is that we said we'll cut down on the water use itself. I mean, at every aspect from mining to processing to retail to purchase till the building material is on site and how the building material is finally used on the site, there is a water audit that if you do, you'll see the budget of water is quite high. Some of the things we cannot directly impact because we are not in control of the cement industry. We can reduce the quantity of cement use. We can reduce the amount of steel use, but we cannot actually intervene in the amount of steel use water use in cement manufacturing. So what we try to do is at least reduce the local footprint. besides harvesting rainwater, all the wet areas, whether it's kitchens, bathrooms, toilets, we try not to use ceramic tiles and we use only natural stone and stucco plaster. The advantage of this is that ceramic tiles require not only excessive water to keep clean because of the shiny industrial finish, it always tends to look dirty earlier, but all the grout joints and cleaning of these things require much more water and sometimes even certain chemicals to keep them clean. With stucco plaster, which is also called the IPS, Indian Patent Stone, once it's waxed, traditionally these surfaces are much easier to keep clean because you just have to wipe them dry. Now going to the next aspect, which is the climate. In the climate, we try for three different things, which is integrate solar passive design principles for hot, humid climate. And the building layout, that is the site planning and how the building volumes are integrated with the landscape, is done to avoid heat island effects. We'll come to why we want to avoid heat island effects as I continue. And then aim for maximum periods of comfort level so that we reduce the operational energy use. Now, what's happening is in coastal Tamil Nadu, like many places in peninsular India, you have hot, humid climate because we're not very far from the sea, which means that even though the temperature does not go as high as in the composite climate, because of high humidity, you tend to feel the heat much more. So when it's 38 degrees and 60% humidity, it's as uncomfortable as 46, 47 degrees, whether it's in Madhya Pradesh or in Haryana or Rajasthan, because the amount of humidity causes metabolic discomfort in the body. So what we try to do is we are looking at several aspects that we can utilize from the challenges of the climate in the building design. One of the things is the sun moves from east to west. The morning sun, the air temperature is cooler, so it's not that disturbing. But by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the air temperature is higher. Direct sunlight from the west is actually increasing the heat intake in the building. So we reduce the east and west facade of a building. That by increasing the north and south facade, which is also the facade that has that minimum direct sun. But of course, the sun also moves north and south because the planet has a tilt. In the summer, the sun goes towards the northern hemisphere to the Tropic of Cancer, and towards the winter, it goes to the Tropic of Capricorn. So depending on the angle of the sun, 35.5 degrees, it goes to the south in some winter, but the air temperature is lower, so we are not so concerned. But in the summer, when it goes 12.5 degrees north, the air temperature is higher. So we work with shading devices in such a way that you take care of the sun angles. Another thing that we do is look at the predominant breeze directions and wind speeds. Based on that, there are two different aspects that you can cover, that we try to cover is location of various types of functions within the residential units. When bedrooms for night breeze, which is a land breeze, daytime rooms, which is at the sea breeze level, and creating a wind shadow so that you increase the wind speeds when the summer is, when it's hot, humid, it's actually the lowest wind speed here, but also protecting the buildings from cyclonic storms. And then playing with the type of opening, location of opening, size of opening to ensure maximum ventilation. Because in hot, humid climates, it's only when there's breeze that the sweat dries on the body, cooling the surface of the body and lowering the temperature to provide comfort. So what you see here is the phase 1 and 2 of the project, and it's still continuing. And you have the buildings are all, this is north, this is south. You know, the buildings are all north-south facing with very little facade on the east and west, as you can see. Most of the trees that you see on the image are trees that were already on the land and they've been retained. And we've created wind shadows with the courtyards and pockets within the building to increase the wind speed. And another thing that we have done is the facades, which are west or west facing or southwest facing. We have shaded them and provided for certain kind of indigenous species of trees that are semi-deciduous or non-deciduous, so that the ground temperature around the building does not increase and have reflected radiative heat during the summer, while the facades on the south and south, on the west and southwest, also have long shading devices so that the building facades don't heat up and radiate the heat out during the post sunset. This way, by avoiding heat island effect, in the evenings you can have the windows open, avoiding the need for air conditioning, because air conditioning is one of the biggest contributors for urban heat island effect. And the more it gets hot outside, the more you want the air conditioning inside. The more you have air conditioning inside, the more you have the heat thrown outside. It's like a catch-22. And as you can see here, close up, the middle part, I don't know if the cursor can be seen, but the middle part is where all the roof runoff is being drained and harvested, while on the planted area here is the bioswale that is taking care of the surface water harvesting. The windows and doors, like I told you, are designed and positioned in such a way, even the openings, instead of having just normal openings or sliding, they're actually made in such a way that you can modulate the wind flow by increasing the opening on one side or the other. And all of us have learned as architecture students that the windward side, if you have a smaller opening, and the leeward side, if you have a larger opening, you end up creating wind pressure differences that increases the airflow and also increases the velocity of the airflow. And this is what we try to work with, because predominantly in the summer, during the day, you keep the windows closed, trapping the cool air of the night. So from 8:30 in the morning, let's say, till almost 4:30 in the evening, the windows are closed, curtained off, that you've trapped it. But then in the evening, when the sea breeze starts, you open up the windows in the corners and in the top part of the building, and it starts to flush out the heat, the radiated heat from the walls, which are now, due to time lag, starting to seep into the building. By flushing out the heat, you're creating pockets of cool air that absorb the heat from the walls and the ceiling and flush it out. This lowers the temperature of the inside the building, making it equivalent to the temperature outside the building, creating the cool night air effect outside and the cooler building effect inside, preventing the need for air conditioning. Of course, you will have to use a fan because sometimes the wind speed is really low. How are we sure that it actually worked? So once the phase 1 was ready, we put up sensors. We put up several sensors. In this drawing, you can see some of the, in this next drawing, you can see several sensors. We put up sensors inside the building to look at temperature, humidity, and the lux of the lighting, natural lighting. We put up sensors on the surface of the walls so that we could monitor the time lag and the heat intake between the western side of the wall, which is the critical side. We put up sensors in the ceiling and outside of the roof to also monitor how much was the heat gain from the surface of the roof, which is the biggest heat gain in a building. And we had hour-to-hour temperature logging for 13 months. That means 2 summers, 1 monsoon. And based on this, we worked out the outdoor conditions, indoor conditions of all the different apartments with adaptive comfort level. So basically in June, which is the hot, humid part, when the monsoon has hit the west coast, but for us in the Tamil Nadu, the monsoon we are in the leeward side, so we don't have a monsoon, but the humidity increases without lower temperature. And you can see here in June that 50% of the outdoor conditions was always within comfort zone. So you had only less than a quarter of the time, which was peak sunlight hours, maybe between 11 and 3, that you had outdoor conditions that were falling outside the comfort zone, which means it was 37 degrees to 34 degrees with 30 to 90% relative humidity, which is, of course, anybody will tell you, you don't go and stand outside then. And you keep looking, September, you had between 39 to 45% of the time, you had actually very comfortable to comfortable conditions outdoor. December, of course, and March. But then indoor conditions, when you look at the indoor conditions in same months, almost 60% of the time, indoor conditions were comfortable. That means you had 31 to 35 degrees centigrade, which means that with a fan, you can actually live quite comfortably if you are also wearing clothes which are appropriate to this climate. And by December, March, the comfort level is very comfortable or comfortable. And you had, that was a west facing, but if you see the east facing, all the sensor readings analyze, 75% of the time you had indoor comfort levels in June, September, December, and March. Going to the next part, that was about climatic comfort, which how you can actually achieve it with proper site planning, working with building volumes, balance of built and unbuilt spaces, and shading devices. I'm going to come to the next aspect that we worked on was the buildings itself. How do we achieve efficiency? Now, efficiency can be achieved. I'm talking about building efficiency, not about efficiency of energy or water. That means how do you design so that the functional layout of the building is such that most of the spaces that are built are livable spaces and there's very little circulation or negative spaces. Second is how do you design the shape of the building? The shape of the building is given by walls, floors, and roof. Now, how do you design it in such a way that you have minimum amount of walls, floors, and roof while you have maximum volume that is usable? Why do we want to minimize the surface area? Because by minimizing surface area, you're reducing the amount of building material needed. I mean, for sustainability, we can talk about all kind of things of low embodied energy materials. We can talk about recycled materials. We can talk about other things. But first step is reduce your need. So that is why efficient building envelope design is very, very critical to use the least amount of building material to achieve the maximum amount of space, which is basically volume to surface area, which is simple. All of us have studied geometry. We know how to achieve this, but how to actually bring it into design of building is the challenge of a good architect. Then, of course, the next point is use of building materials and technologies that have lowered embodied energy. And the last but not least is choosing resilient building materials and technology so that we reduce repair and replacement. Often, when people talk about natural building materials with them low embodied energy, they do not take enough concern into also looking at repairs and replacement. Whatever you might be saving in the capital investment part should not be offset during the occupancy stage, where people every few years have to repair and replace stuff, because then through the lifetime cost of the building, you end up actually having invested more in terms of the carbon per square meter of the built space. So what you see here is the finished buildings, phase one, and I'm going to now walk you through the various aspects of the building. All the walls of the building are made up of two different materials. One is what we call poured earth concrete. Now, this is a mix of earth stabilized with 5% cement by weight, which means that if I'm using one bag of cement, which is 50 kilos, I can actually have 95 kilos of earth. No, 950 kilos of earth. It's 5% by weight mixed with construction waste. So all these granules that you see is actually debris from construction sites where they break off bits of cement, bricks, and concrete and other things. We buy construction and demolition waste, break them up, grade them, mix them with earth and cement, and we pour it between shutterings, like here. These are shuttering planks. We pour this earth between the shuttering, vibrate it, and when it's de-shuttered, after 5 hours, you actually get earth walls that are like concrete walls, but made of earth and construction and demolition waste. One of the advantages of this wall is, besides reusing construction demolition waste, is that it can be done with low skill labor and it goes very fast. I mean, you have earth construction using blocks, but when you excavate the earth, sieve it, make blocks, stack it for 3 weeks and only then use it, you need a lot of space. When you're doing rammed earth, mixing it and ramming it, you still need to have people who are able to monitor the compression aspect. With this one, with the right mix, where you can actually, after soil test, say how much water, how much cement, all by measurement, you mix it in, and almost everybody knows how to do concrete. So it's actually, instead of concrete, you're using earth and construction demolition waste with a little bit of cement. So the technological aspect remains more or less the same. It's the materials that have changed. So you make a transition from a known skill into an innovative material. And this is like almost bridging the gap between conventional and non-conventional construction. The next part that you see here is the lower end of the walls and certain areas which will be damaged by driving rain. We have used Kadapa trimmings. What happens is that in Renigunta district and Kadapa district in Telangana, they mine Kadapa boulders, which is a sedimentary rock, and then they slice it off into slabs, and then they trim off the edges to get rectilinear shape. All these trimmings are dumped in farmlands of distressed farmers who are unable to continue farming because of failure of rain. They are not able to pay back loans that they have taken. So they actually lease the farmland to the industries that are cutting Kadapa stones for marketing. What we are trying to do is actually get from the factories these waste trimmings and use them directly as a building material. This way, the factory has a place where it can send off its trimming, and it does not pollute good farmland where it is just piled up and the stone dust is leaching into the soil and killing off the topsoil. And one of the good things about it is that when it's done and with the pointing that is done, it's also self-shading and it's quite durable. So you can see them here, the finished walls, they're light gray, and we have deep grooves in between, which provides a minimum shading to the walls. And it's very good walls for areas which are exposed to heavy rainfalls or cyclonic, the sides where we get the cyclones from. Going on to the roofing, you saw in the first photo that we have walls. We have walls between floors as ceilings. So between the ground floor and the first floor, it is what we call segmental arch vault. These are made with local fired bricks, which are extremely porous and brittle. But an advantage of using local fired bricks is that they're very good at sound absorption, because vaults tend to resonate and carry the sound. So for audio privacy between apartments, by using these fired bricks, which are porous, we actually deaden the sound. And using centering, these segmental vaults are done. We have a sliding centering. So every day about 2 meters is done. And then next morning, the centering is slid and a new set of bricks are laid to continue with the segmental arch vault. This is how the vault looks when it's finished. It provides us with good under the ceiling ventilation and lighting. And this is how it is from inside, just after the vault has been done. And this is how it looks after the vaults have been finished and the buildings are finished. So now you have a vault, but you have a floor here. What's happening in these spaces? We come to that. Styrofoam, or how we call it in India, thermocol. Now, thermocol is a material that is extensively used in packing, in insulation, in transport. But unfortunately, it is a material now which is not only high energy consumption for manufacturing, it does not decompose. It breaks down. When you leave a piece of thermocol outside, it crumbles and becomes microparticles of thermocol, but each particle can last for centuries. And we have a lot of thermocol waste. Every time you take the highway and you go, you will see thermocol flying around. You go to any of the rivers and streams, you see bits of thermocol floating. Fishes have thermocol in their stomachs. We are eating them. There are other mammals and animals which also have thermocol that has gone into their biological systems. So one of the things we said is, can we address this issue? Because Pondicherry, it has a large number of assembly factories. So all the parts that come in for assembly from different parts of the country and the world comes packed in thermocol. And of course, in Auroville, we also receive Amazon packages, which also have thermocol. So we have been collecting thermocol from the general area using the mechanical skills of one of the persons in Auroville, a Swiss person. He has designed and manufactured a shredding machine which can shred different particle size, like these are the bigger ones than these and the smaller ones. We mix it with cement and sand, and we use it as infill material. It's lightweight. This way we are actually packing in the thermocol and preventing it from spreading into the landscape. Being lightweight can be used as under the floor filling. Being a good insulation material, it provides insulation from noise and heat. So finally, you have the floor made of thermocol, which is a waste recycling. We have walls made with trimmings from the Kadapa factory, which is another waste recycling. We have poured earth walls, which have construction and demolition waste inside. So in a way, the entire envelope of the building has a high amount of recycled materials, plus innovation that has gone into reuse of the recycling materials. And and all the woodwork, that's another thing I wanted to do. All the woodwork that we have is also made of recycled wood. Here, it's a bit painful because Pondicherry, which is a town only 12 kilometers south of Auroville, there are beautiful heritage homes, and beautiful homes which are not heritage, but are vernacular architecture from the last 200 years. Now, due to the cost of land and the land value going up, a lot of these old homes, which are ground plus one, ground plus two, are being taken down, and new buildings are coming up. Faceless concrete boxes with cement plaster are coming up. But all these old ceilings with madras roofs, the wooden beams, the wooden columns, the wooden doors and windows, these are actually sold. We have 2 or 3 roads in and out of Pondicherry where you can find a lot of this wood being sold. So we actually go and buy them, looking at the sizes of the woods and the type of wood that is available, design the doors and windows, keeping what the recycled wood availability is. This way, we waste very little wood in reshaping them. And finally, the ceilings. We talked about heat intake through the roof. Now, heat intake through the roof is managed in 3 different ways. We have the thermocol packing, but then we also have the porous porous fired bricks in segmental arches. But the final layer over is done with 3rd quality ceramic tiles. This acts as a cool roof, reflecting the heat. Originally, we used to be able to get factory reject tiles because there's a ceramic tile factory south of Pondicherry. But right now, their machinery and processing has improved so much that they hardly have any rejects. So we buy 3rd quality tiles from them, and we use that as a cool roof on top of all the roofs, whether it's this project or any other project, to really have reflective roofs to reduce the heat intake. Coming to the next part, which is energy, because climate, buildings, energy, all these 3 are very interlinked. So in energy, like I told you in the climatic comfort part, the functional layout of the spaces is in keeping with the climate. And this allows us to minimize the operational energy used within the building, besides, of course, playing with ventilation, natural lighting, and shading. You can only do so much with functional space layout and minimizing operational energy, because at one point, it does get dark in the night. At one point, the temperature and humidity outside is such that no matter what you do, it still gets hot, humid inside, and you would need energy to run a fan. So this is what we have done. We have tried to size, position, and shape all apertures so that they are modulated for daylight. And I'm not talking about maximum daylight condition. Maximum daylight condition is the worst that you can achieve, because in hot, humid climates, you have glare and Large openings means not just maximum light, but also maximum heat. So you really need to work with your windows and doors that you get good daylight with a lux that is proper, but keeping out the glare. Glare is basically a condition that comes with humidity. Humidity causes suspended water molecules, which then reflect the sunlight in all direction, creating a painful condition where if you look up at the sky looks gray and the sun looks like a lighter gray in the summer, but it's actually because of all these little spherical molecules of water that are all reflecting the sunlight. So when you go to places which have low humidity, you will have blue skies, but places with high humidity often has grayish white sky because of that. So which direction the aperture is for the ventilation and light, but also the size and the shading of the apertures cuts the glare. Another thing that cuts the glare very well is mosquito mesh painted black. When the mosquito mesh is painted black, you cut glare, but you do not impede the visual access to the space outside. You look through the mesh instead of looking at the mesh. If you have white painted mesh or stainless steel mesh, it reflects back the light, like in the night when you have the light on and you want to look out of the closed window, you see your own reflection. It's basically light colored mesh works like that. But dark colored mesh not only cuts off the glare, it allows you to look through it. And the building shape itself, because of the way it's oriented, reduces the operational energy needs. Over and above that, in almost all the flat roofs, we have installed photovoltaic panels. These photovoltaic panels are connected to the local grid of Tamil Nadu Electricity Board. So during the daytime, we are energy producers feeding into the grid, which is offset with the energy that we consume from the grid in the night and in the monsoon. Now, it's almost 24 months since this project has been operational, and we can say overall we are net positive, which is shown here. You can see we started the post occupancy monitoring from July 2019 to July 2020, 13 months totally. So what you see is that the total energy consumption is the blue line, and the orange line is the energy production. So when you see our net positivity, except during May, June, now during the COVID lockdown, where a net positivity went down a bit, most of the time we have maintained a certain amount of net positivity from between the production and consumption. And if you look at per person consumption of energy, this is the gray line is the standard ASHRAE line for tropical climates. And if you see what we are consuming on average per person, it is almost less than 50% of the standard. So it's actually, besides not just the climatic comfort in the building due to design and building materials, we'll come to this later, by working with people in terms of awareness building and capacity building, we've been able to make people conscious about different other aspects of how they can save energy. Of course, using low energy fixtures and bulbs and things like that is part of the scheme. We come now to the next part, waste. Of course, any human settlement is going to take in resources, water, energy, food, clothing, and it gives out waste. So it's like a kind of cycle. You take in all the resources, and what comes out after you've consumed the resources is waste. Now, waste can take all kind of forms. We have sewage, which is the bodily waste that we have between the toilets, showers, and kitchen. And then the solid waste, which is all the food, packaging, and other products that come in through our other consumption. We have, over the last 20 years in Oroville, come up with fine-tuned a system that we call DWATS, which is a gravity-based natural recycling system, which takes all the three different sewage, which means yellow, which is urine, gray, which is all the wash water, and black, which is from the toilet. It takes all the three sewage and it recycles it in closed tanks through a system of flow rate and tank sizes, allowing anaerobic bacteria. It's closed, so it's without oxygen, allowing anaerobic bacteria to break down the waste, and then filtering it and allowing it to be then either using plants to reoxygenate the water or using what we call the vortex system to reoxygenate the water to create ponds from which the water is then eventually used for all the irrigation in the gardens and around the homes. Right now, we are not using this water as secondary water for flushing because the system does not allow yet total removal of the turbidity. So when it stands for more than 24 hours in closed tanks, it starts to smell again. But we are well aware that we need to improve the system so that we can reuse the water for flushing, because the flush water is almost 35 to 40% of our water consumption in a household. So if you look at our water consumption, the orange line is the Indian standard requirement, okay, which is 135 liters per person per day. And if you look at the water consumption pattern, like with energy, May, June, July, we had a higher consumption of water per person because they did not go out to work. Everybody stayed home. So the whatever water they were consuming in workspaces or in educational spaces and other spaces had to be consumed inside here. But in spite of that, if you look at it, it actually is very much within the standards. And when we came to waste, what we have worked out is that we have waste that is segregated in every household. All biodegradable waste is composted on site. And this is a regulation that we put into place that no biodegradable waste leaves a settlement. There'll be composting on site and reuse in the landscape. Only non-biodegradable waste can leave a settlement. And before it leaves a settlement, it is segregated into various parts, which is glass, plastic, paper, sanitary, things that go to landfill because they cannot be recycled. Because glass goes to recycling, plastic recyclers pick up the plastic, paper goes into paper recycling guys who make handmade paper, sanitary landfill goes into incinerators, and mixed, this is unfortunately mixed is, all your Tetra packs and other things, they also go into landfill sometimes. And you can see the waste generated per person, this is in kilos. So if you look at it per person in 1 month, it's less than a kilo of paper and 65 grams of plastic. And you can see it is almost less than 55% of sanitary. And so you see that it is not ideal, but every time we have a workshop and we try to do it, there is a sharp drop. Then it keeps going up, and then we do another workshop and it drops, and then it goes up. But so what we realize is that changing of lifestyle does not happen by just one article or one workshop or one lecture. You have to do it over a long period of time, because the habit as it is set within us, it does not change. Enthusiasm changes it for a month, and then we go back to our previous habits. Finally, I'll come to the last part, which is lifestyle. So all the different aspects, whether it's land planning or site planning, as we call it, dealing with water, whether it's rainwater, sewage, or roof water, building for climatic comfort, building efficiently and using appropriate building materials, whether we're working with lowered energy consumption and generating energy, we're recycling our sewage, recycling our waste, all this will not have the kind of effect we want unless there's also lifestyle change. And I think with this past 8 to 10 months of this pandemic, it has come to everybody's notice that lifestyle is one of the things that we really need to relook at. With more and more people working out of homes, a lot of economic downturn, that we start to look at lifestyle as something which is much more minimal and more responsible, with a lot more sharing. So we tackled lifestyle in 3 different ways. Climate appropriate lifestyle in terms of clothing, food, and timing of metabolic activity. What does it mean? In most urban India in the last 30 years, the way we clothe ourselves has completely changed. People are wearing ties and jackets in the summer. People are wearing closed leather shoes and boots, even when it's hot, humid. So, or they're wearing, eating food that creates heat, or they're eating food that comes from very far away, apples from New Zealand and lychees from the Himalayas and stuff like that, which has a lot of carbon miles in it. And it's not appropriate to the climate when you eat it. The Ayurvedic guys will tell you eat with the climate, but we still, when we eat fast food, a lot of the food that we eat not only has carbon miles, but is creating a certain amount of metabolic activity in digestion and other things, which creates discomfort in our body, which requires then that we have air conditioning. Inappropriate clothing demands air conditioning. And the worst of all is the type of activity we do. I have seen in Delhi people going to the gym in the summer at 4:35 in the afternoon, which is the peak heat time, and having the gym air conditioned at 18 to 20 degrees centigrade because they're all feeling very hot. But anybody would tell you if you want to work out during the peak heat period of the day, of course you're going to feel hot. But everything is organized that you can disconnect the activity to the actual climate and the time of the day so that you have a choice. But the problem with choice is that soon we may not have a choice. Yeah. Climate change is real, and the kind of biodiversity loss that we're looking at is real. The resources are, diminishing by the day. India is today consuming more than 1.5 times its carbon output. That means no matter what we do, we are not able to produce biologically the amount of resources that we're consuming. And over and above, we have gone past peak oil. So at some point, we have to realize that choice is actually a delusional thing that is being produced by the market economy and being fed to us. The next aspect we looked at was electromechanical appliances. This is something that when we studied it, we realized that there's so much of duplication in all the households. Like, for example, let me tell you, if you have a blender, a mixer blender in your house, you might use it once or twice a day and it just sits there. Whether you use it or not, within 2.5, 3 years, you have to replace it because the industrial manufacturing sector can only generate jobs and profit by replacement and not by repair. If they're sharing of this appliance between a couple of households which are all on the same landing, it still will last 2.5 years, but you buy one instead of four. And when you replace that one, you have produced much less waste because many of these appliances, the energy content that goes into manufacturing it is never actually utilized during the life cycle of its use. And it all goes back into creating more waste that are landfills and pollution in our water system. And the last thing is actually doing research and producing information to people that they can access to find and use local products which are responsible for cradle to cradle cycles. And this is basically the graphic that we came up with, which is saying you have to first develop a geographical and climatic awareness. If you are living in hot, humid climate, please be aware that it is going to be hot, it is humid. So try to accept it and live with it rather than fight it and then try to find ways and means to earn an income to produce mechanical stuffs, electrical stuff to fight it. Second is work out daily routine, which is in sync with the daylight hours so that you reduce operational energy needs. Have work-life balance. Go for appropriate and resilient clothing. Avoid fast fashion. Fast fashion is creating a huge problem in India. Today, on an average, urban India, people below the age of 35 are going through 6 to 8 fashion cycles annually. And the clothing which is discarded, which goes into landfills, is a huge problem. I don't know how many of you remember 3 years ago when there was a slow fire of the landfill outside Bombay, creating enormous pollution and discomfort to the people of Bombay. Most of it was actually clothing. We have the same problem in Chennai, same problem in Delhi. A lot of fast fashion is shoddy clothing, bad chemical dyes polluting the water streams, and dumping in landfills. Use of energy is never really taken into account. And the worst aspect of it is that it is low paying jobs for the poor in very, very dangerous conditions. We all have seen, read, and on television and newspapers and our social media about the number of places in Bangladesh and others where the buildings collapse, they catch fire, and people working in clothing industry being killed. And they work for such minimum wages and for more than 10 to 12 hours a day. So appropriate, resilient clothing makes a huge difference between how much energy you use within your household to the kind of pollution and exploitation globally. Locally sourced food and plant-based diet, because most of the plants and food, if you're eating seasonally, creates a much better and reduces the demand for cooling that we have. Last but not least, this has nothing to do with the building sciences or building design or architecture, is having an equitable and tolerant attitude. Because a lot of our needs, or what we call needs, are compensatory consumption, or what we call imitative consumption, because we don't feel happy. We are not content. We always feel that we have less than others. But if you're more equitable and tolerant, the less will have more, and the more will try to have less. And that creates already a better environment, and it will affect atmospheric pollution. It will reduce pollution in the water sources, and it'll create socially more balanced life. So with this, I'm going to stop, and I'm coming back to thank you all for having listened to me. And I hope I kept within my timeline. If not, I'm very sorry about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Architect Suhasini Iyer, for a delightful presentation. We will now be moving to another short break to play our sponsor's video, and we'll be back with our next speaker.
Regular cement takes 28 days to make an airstrip. This one just took 4. Yes, it is the technology of the future, brought to us today by Dalmia Cement. And I'm building my house with the same.
Dalmia Cement, future today.
I'm a forest ranger, and I don't allow any interference in the jungles. But this wildlife corridor was needed, so we built it with the world's greenest cement, Dalmia. And now I'm building my own house with the same.
Dalmia Cement, future today.
An 8-foot slab of concrete that can take a load of 500 tons, moving at such speed. Yes, it's the technology of the future. Brought to us today by the pioneers of sleeper cement, Dalmia. And I'm building my house with the same.
Dalmia Cement, future today.